Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, welcome back to my lecture. So today we are going to continue our discussion on the tax incidence, but not in context of perfect competitive markets, but today we are going to talk about what happens in case of imperfect competitive markets, and if tax is imposed on either on the consumer or on the producers through the commodity. So how tax gets split between two, or how tax burden is shared between consumer and producers. So let's begin our discussion. So in case of tax incidence without perfect competitive markets, so we already know that all the features and the characteristics of the perfect competitive markets and also imperfect competitive markets. So we already know that two other extreme cases that we already discussed in our previous lectures. One is of course the characteristics of the perfect competitive markets, and the other characteristics is like what happens in case of monopoly, which is another extreme cases of the market conditions. So in between also we discussed like how what happens in between perfect competitions and monopoly like monopolistic competitions. What are the market conditions in case of oligopoly and duopoly? So today when we talk about the tax incidence, we are going to talk about monopoly, and then you can actually understand like how it will be impact on the other imperfect markets. So as a students of economics, we are supposed to know all the characteristics and then basic assumptions of different types of markets. So let us actually understand how it happens in case of monopoly market. So to begin our discussion, let us talk about the taxing a monopoly with horizontal marginal cost. So here we are talking about tax incidence without perfect competitions. Two cases that we will be discussing here. In a linear demand curve, the price paid by consumer raises by the exact half of the tax, or we can actually say that how much the tax division, that tax burden will be divided between consumer and producers, and producers and consumer, how they actually share the taxes. So this is what the other case that we are going to discuss here is with the constant elasticity of demand curve, the price rises more than the taxes. So we'll discuss this in our discussion today. So let's take the first case. If we can say that this is the first case and this is case 2. So let us first talk about the case number 1, where we are assume like this is what quantity on the horizontal axis and price on the vertical axis, and then as we know the demand curve for monopoly, it will be represented by average revenue, and therefore average revenue will be equals to demand curve, and then marginal revenue will be half of the average revenue. As we know, the slope of the marginal revenue is exactly the half of the average revenue, which is our demand function. So now let us assume that marginal cost curve is or supply curve is perfectly elastic, and then we will talk about if we impose tax on the producers or on the commodities, and then how producers will actually enact to that imposition of the tax. So suppose so this is what marginal cost curve that we can assume, like marginal cost, or the supply curve of the firm, which is perfectly elastic. So now the first equilibrium point that we know here, like monopoly, we already know this, but then any market including monopolies, rationality is to maximize its profit, and then first order condition for the profit maximization, it will start at a point where marginal revenue will be equals to marginal cost. So here the point where marginal revenue is intersecting the marginal cost. So along with this quantity Q1, so OQ1 is the quantity demanded under monopoly, and then price will be, price under monopoly is like say P1, right? So OP1 is the price under monopoly, and OQ1 is the quantity demanded under monopoly. So now assume that tax will be imposed, and therefore naturally marginal cost for the producers will be increased, and then overall supply curve will be going upward, and then it will shift parallelly. It will shift exactly by the amount of the taxes. So let's assume this is the marginal cost, one curve, which is, we can see S1. So S1 is nothing, is basically S plus T. So the amount that we are talking about here is basically the T. So now look at the new conditions, especially from the monopolist point of view, again from the profit maximization's point of view. So what is the profit maximization point that a monopolist will enact? So here again the point at which marginal revenue and marginal cost, they will be intersecting at each other. So we have the new marginal cost curve, which is MC1. So MC1 and MR, they are interacting or intersecting at point, say new point, which is B, and earlier before the tax, marginal cost is intersecting at the marginal revenue, which is at point say A. So now as marginal cost has increased, so with the profit maximization conditions, output will be decreased from Q1 to Q2, and along with this equilibrium point, like point B, where MR equals to MC, so in the monopoly price will increase to OP2, so which is higher because marginal cost, this is primarily because of the marginal cost curve. So we can see that price has increased from P1 to OP1 to P2, and then tax is also has increased by T. And so here definitely increase in the price is actually a reflection of the rise in the taxation. So now with a new equilibrium point where new MC, like MC1 is intersecting with marginal revenue, and then the first order condition, that is the first order condition of the profit maximization for firm here for the monopolist, and that is the point B, and you can see that price is increasing from OP1 to OP2. So the rise in the price, like changes in the price, like delta P is like P1 and P2, which is almost the half of the tax, the changes that the amount of taxes that are imposed on the marginal cost curve on the producer. So it is basically the over a half of the total tax. So this is what we are trying to show here, like what happens when tax is imposed on the monopoly market, and then monopolist firm will increase the price, but then the price will be the rise in the price, like changes in the price will be less than the amount of taxes that will be imposed by the producers. So half of the price actually will be borne by the producers, and then only P1 to P1, P2 amount of the tax will be borne by the consumer, and then larger share of the tax will be borne by the producers. So now we can actually again we can go ahead with the case 2, where the constant elasticity demand curve and the price rises more than the taxes. So let us see that when demand curve is not linear in that case. So if demand curve is just simple downward sloping, so let us draw this. We can see, we can measure P like price on the vertical axis and Q on the horizontal axis, and then assume demand curve, which is nothing, is also AR curve, and then marginal revenue curve, which is again downward sloping, and then here we can say that this is marginal cost curve, MC1, and then again the equilibrium conditions where marginal revenue is equals to marginal cost. So that is the point A, and then say Q1, OQ1 is the amount of quantity will be produced, and then monopoly price will be OP1. So now say tax is imposed, and that is MC2, and the new equilibrium point where marginal cost and marginal revenue, they are intersecting, like say point B. So along with this, so quantity is reduced because tax is imposed, and then new price that we got it like P2, and here the amount of the tax is small t, the difference between MC1 and MC2. So MC2 is basically MC1 plus T. So this difference between two marginal cost curve is basically the amount of the taxes. So here the amount of taxes, and we can see clearly the price increase, like the quantity has reduced because of the imposition of the taxes, and monopoly price also has increased, but then changes in the price like P1, P2 amount is higher than the amount of taxes is imposed. So in these two cases it is very clear that price, there will be changes in the price with the changes or with the imposition of the taxes on the farm, because marginal cost for the production will be increased for the producers. And that's how in the imperfect competitive market, like especially in case of monopoly, so here this is how changes in the quantity happens and also changes in the price happens. So let us move forward, and then let us talk about what happens when tax is imposed on labor, like say payroll taxes levied on the farms, and then how tax incidence happens on the demand and supply for the labor. So this is what let us talk about that. So tax on labor, if tax on labor is levied or imposed, then generally demand curve, like here demand curve is like labor demand curve will shift downward and wage will be reduced, and also employment will be reduced. So now this is what the assumption. So here now let us assume in case of labor demand and labor supply. So labor supply is like, it is assumed like it shows the relationship between, or labor's choice between, or labor's trade-off between working hour and the leisure. So and that is why it is to be believed that labor supply curve is first increases and then backward bending. So backward bending part of the labor supply curve is basically as income increases for the workers, then workers will be choosing more leisure as compared to the work. So as as the standard of living for the workers increases, then workers also will start valuing more on the leisure, or will give more value on the, say, vacations and others. That is how the trade-off between wage, working hours and the leisure happens, because total number of working hour and total number of leisure will be limited within the total number of work hours in the day, like for instance 24 hours in a day. So so that is what the typical discussion on the labor supply and labor demand, that will not discuss much more in details, but certainly the nature of the labor supply curve actually determine what happens if tax is imposed on the labor, or and then how it happens or changes on the labor demand. So let us first see usually what happens in the labor market with the labor demand and labor supply, and then we'll also consider what happens when we show in the upward sloping of the or backward bending part of the labor supply curve. So we can take the help of the graphical illustration, like here, say, along with the vertical axis is the price, but then here price of the labor, which is wage, and then quantity of, say, labor is basically, say, employment. So now, so labor demand, say labor demand function is this one, LD1, and here labor supply curve, and we are considering only upward part of the labor supply curve. So now if tax is imposed or levied on the labor, and then obviously labor cost from the producer's point of view, from firm's point of view, cost of the production also will be increased. But then in this particular case, if tax is imposed on the labor, then labor demand curve will be downward sloping, because tax is imposed, and therefore producers will enact that way, and the demand for labor will be low. So earlier, so we got the first equilibrium point here, where LD1 is intersecting with the labor supply curve at point A, and at point A total labor supply is OL1, and then wage that got determined is like OW1. So now as tax is imposed on the labor, and then labor demand goes backward, like demand for labor will be reduced, and then we got the new equilibrium point, which is point B, where point B is a point at which labor supply LS and L2T, they are intersecting with each other, and then as a result overall employment or the overall amount of labor will be reduced from OL1 to OL2, and then wage has decreased, like from OW1 to OW2. So in this particular case, with the taxation, imposition of the tax on the labor, so labor demand will be reduced, because cost of labor for the producers in the cost of production will be increased. But then as a result, employment also will be decreased, and labor wage for the labor also will be reduced. So this is a negative wage, but then we can see the amount of taxation on which labor demand is reduced. It is like this particular amount, like small t, like say we get another 1 point, so say point C. So B and C, the amount the amount of B and C is basically the tax. So with a new equilibrium point, like say at point B, wage was supposed to fixed at wage W3, but it will not be fixed at OW3 amount, because this is mainly the taxes, and therefore some portion of the taxes will be borne by the labor, and that is actually, this is what the wage change. So this W1 and W2 is the wage change, we can say, as changes in the, like we can say the tax burden borne by worker or labor. And then W2 and W3 is the amount of tax, like small t. So here, why there is a reflection in the new equilibrium point at a point at point B, that wage is reduced. So in actually wages has not reduced, but then wage, this reduction in the wage is basically the tax burden for the workers, which will be reflected in their wage changes. So here the total amount of tax is like this: from W2 and W3 amount of taxes, W1 and W2 amount of taxes will be reflected through their wages. So it is quite general, and for the rational producers always try to adjust the tax through either through passing on to the workers, or it will be reflected through the reduction in the cost of production. And one of the variable cost that producer always touch in case of adjustment in the prices, and that is through the wages, through labor cost. So this is what we call that workers, if you recollect that we already spoke about backward tax shifting. So this particular portion, like what when producers will transfer the tax onto the workers. So this is an example of the backward tax shifting. So this is how the imposition of the tax will be borne by the workers, and also some of the amount like W1 and W3 will be borne by the producers. The amount of the tax burden by the producers. So now let's move to next, and then we can actually see this tax on labor levied on the farms, and then we are trying to understand here tax incidence on the demand and backward bending supply curve. So let us understand this. So I am again drawing, like wage will be measured along with the vertical axis, and then amount of employment of the labor will be measured along with the horizontal axis, and then this is like backward bending. We are taking only upward part of the backward bending, and then say this is demand curve, like say demand D1, and here is basically the labor demand, and this is say labor supply. We can say that labor demand 1. So here it is actually L1 or L1 amount of labor, that is the employment that firm is producing at the initial equilibrium point, which is A, where labor demand and labor supply, they are intersecting to each other. So now the case is like tax is imposed on the labor, and therefore labor demand curve will go downward, as we know. So here, so this we get new labor demand curve, which is LD2, and then this difference between LD1 and LD2 is due to the tax, and then amount the shift of the labor demand will be the exact amount by of the taxes. So we can see we get the new equilibrium here. So L2. So employment in fact has increased from OL1 amount to OL2, and then at the initial at point A we have the wage rate of OW1, but then after tax imposition, as demand curve shifts downward, we get the new equilibrium point where wage is getting determined at OW2. So this is the point B, at equilibrium point B, and the amount of tax here, it is very clear, like this amount, like A, C, and here we can also put it D. So certainly we can see like this is the amount of T. So T, which is AC amount, which is certainly less than the total amount of the changes in the wage, which is W1, W2, or the amount like A and D. So this is what we are trying to say here. Tax will be less than the wage. So tax is basically this much of tax that we got it. So now the point here, 2 points, is like wage is decreasing quite substantially because people are giving more priority on the work as compared to the leisure. So trade-off relationship that I just in our previous slide that we discussed, like labor supply curve, it's nothing, is basically the trade-off between how much working hour that labor will use for their working purpose, or the how much amount of the leisure that worker or labor will kind of entail with that. So this trade-off relationship between working hour and the leisure will be changed because of because of the imposition of the taxes on the labor demand, and therefore labor demand will be reduced. The moment labor demand will be reduced, there will be higher pressure on the labor supply, and therefore amount of employment will be increased. But then the amount of labor has increased, like from OL1 to OL2. This actually will create downward pressure on the wage, and then wage will be reduced, and this wage substantial wage will be reduced, which will be much more higher. This wage gap will be much more higher as compared to the amount of the tax that is imposed. So this is what the case where tax is imposed on the labor demand on the farm, and especially the situation where trade-off between working hour and leisure are also very important as far as labor supply is concerned. So I stop here, and then these are the 2 references that I have used to prepare this lecture. So for further details or for more examples in different other countries' context, you are also encouraged to follow these 2 books, and I thank you for your attention, and I'll see you in my next class.